A team of astronauts aboard the International Space Station discovers an extraterrestrial life form that proves to be more intelligent and dangerous than they anticipated. The unmanned Pilgrim 7 space probe, which is on its way back from Mars to the International Space Station, ISS, carrying a soil sample that potentially holds evidence of alien life, encounters an asteroid field and sustains severe damage. The 6-person crew aboard the ISS successfully captures the spacecraft, and exobiologist Hugh Derry manages to revive a dormant cell from the sample. The cell rapidly develops into a multi-celled organism, affectionately named Calvin by American school children. Unfortunately, an accident in the laboratory renders Calvin inactive. To revive Calvin, Hugh administers mild electric shocks, but the organism unexpectedly turns hostile, attacking Hugh and causing severe damage to his hand. While Hugh is unconscious, Calvin uses the electric shock device to break free from its immediate confinement. Now unleashed within the laboratory, Calvin consumes a laboratory rat by absorbing it, resulting in its growth and size. Engineer Rory Adams takes this opportunity to enter the room and rescue Hugh, but Calvin latches onto Rory's leg. Rory's attempts to fend off Calvin using a flamethrower prove futile, as the organism enters his mouth and kills him by devouring his internal organs. Calvin emerges from Rory's mouth even larger and escapes through a fire control vent. Hugh posits that the absence of breathable air on Mars kept the organism in a dormant state. After losing communication with Earth due to the communication system's overheating, Mission Commander Ekaterina Golovkina embarks on a spacewalk to rectify the issue. However, Calvin manages to breach the cooling systems and launches an attack on Ekaterina outside the ISS. In the process, Calvin ruptures her spacesuit's coolant system, leading to the release of toxic liquid into her helmet. Despite her struggles to return to the safety of the ISS, Ekaterina eventually realizes that Calvin would also be able to enter the space station. Refusing to open the airlock for help and preventing David from doing so as well, Ekaterina keeps Calvin outside the station. Tragically, this leads to her drowning in her spacesuit, and her lifeless body drifts away into the depths of space. Calvin persistently tries to infiltrate the station through the thrusters. The crew endeavors to employ the thrusters to block Calvin's access points, but their efforts prove futile, resulting in the excessive loss of fuel. As a consequence, the ISS begins to enter a decaying orbit, which will eventually lead to the station burning up upon re-entry into Earth's atmosphere. Pilot Sho Murakami notifies the crew that they must utilize the remaining fuel to establish a safe orbit. However, this action would allow Calvin to re-enter the station. In light of this situation, the crew devises a plan to render Calvin dormant. They decide to seal themselves inside one module while venting the atmosphere from the rest of the station. As Hugh succumbs to cardiac arrest, the crew makes a startling discovery: Calvin has been nourishing itself by feeding off Hugh's leg. Having transformed into a larger creature with tentacles, Calvin launches a vicious attack on the remaining crew members. In a desperate bid for survival, Sho barricades himself inside a sleeping pod while Calvin relentlessly tries to shatter the glass and consume him. Meanwhile, David and quarantine officer Miranda North devise a plan to use Hugh's lifeless body as bait, drawing Calvin away from Sho and trapping it within a module to deprive it of oxygen. Prior to the communication system damage on the ISS, Earth receives a distress signal and dispatches a Soyuz capsule as a contingency measure to propel the station into deep space. The capsule successfully docks with the station and initiates the process of pushing it away from Earth. Mistakenly believing it to be a rescue mission, Sho exits his pod in haste and rushes to board the incoming ship, forcibly opening the hatch. However, this action triggers an attack from Calvin, jeopardizing both Sho and the Soyuz crew. The ensuing encounter leads to a breach in the docking mechanism, causing the capsule to detach and crash into the ISS. Tragically, Sho and the Soyuz pilots meet their demise in the collision. With David and Miranda now being the sole survivors, they come to the realization that the incident has once again placed them in a decaying orbit. Understanding that Calvin could survive the re-entry process, David recalls the existence of two escape pods. Their plan involves luring Calvin into one of the pods and piloting it into deep space, while Miranda uses the other pod to safely return to Earth. David manages to lure Calvin into his pod and launches into space while Miranda launches her pod simultaneously. However, one of the pods collides with debris, causing it to veer off its intended course. In the midst of the chaos, Calvin attacks David, who struggles to propel his pod further into deep space. Eventually, the pods separate from each other. The pod destined for Earth executes a controlled re-entry and lands in the ocean near a fishing boat occupied by two Vietnamese fishermen. Curiosity peaks as they approach the pod, only to discover David trapped within a web-like substance. Meanwhile, Miranda's pod suffers damage from the debris collision, leading to a malfunction and failure of her navigation system. Helplessly, she can only scream as her pod hurtles through the vast expanse of deep space, propelling her toward a desolate and inevitable demise. Still alive, David attempts to warn the unsuspecting fishermen against attempting a rescue. As two additional fishing boats arrive on the scene, the fishermen open the door of the pod, unaware of the impending danger they are about to face.